Hello everyone and welcome to our presentation, What is the Role of Family Farms in U.S. Agriculture? Our presenter today is James McDonald. Jim is the Chief of the Structure, Technology, and Productivity Branch at the Economic Research Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Among other areas of research, his branch analyzes the changing organization and structure of farms and the farm sector. His branch is also responsible for the annual Agricultural Research Management Survey, or ARMS, which is USDA's primary source of data on farm and farm household finances and field-level production practices. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Nancy. Briefly, I'm going to talk about the following 4 topics. First, agricultural production is shifting to larger farms and has been for quite some time. But second, family farms still dominate agriculture. In fact, production is shifting to larger family farms. We're going to spend a little time exploring why. In particular, we're going to ask, why is it that family organizations dominate agriculture, which is really unique in the U.S. economy? Second, there are some other non-family organizations involved in agriculture. We're going to look at what the role of other organizational forms, like large diversified corporations, is in agriculture. Now, to start with, it's important to think a little bit about the way we describe agriculture and statistics produced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And here I want to describe the skewness of production in agriculture. That is the wide variation of farm sizes. That's important for what we're going to talk about later. What we've done here is to sort U.S. farms into 6 different size categories, ranging from farms with less than $10,000 in sales and ranging up to, on the right, farms with $5 million or more in sales. Now, in USDA statistics, we count about 2.1 million places that we define as farms. However, it's important to realize that about half of those have less than $10,000 in sales, and most of those are actually fairly close to zero. They have some land, they may have some horses or other types of livestock, but in fact, collectively they produce very little, less than 1% of total U.S. agricultural production. When we think of small farms, I think most people actually think in terms of the next category in the picture, that is farms with somewhere between $10,000 and $150,000 in sales. There are still very many of them. They represent about 1/3 of the 2.1 million farms in the U.S. economy, and they account for about 10% of total agricultural output. That's a significant amount of production, about $35 billion worth of production in 2016. But in numbers, they're actually swamped by that very, very small category. However, notice that production is actually heavily concentrated in the larger categories. Farms with at least $1 million in sales, and we show here 2 categories, those with between $1 million and $5 million, and those with more than $5 million in sales. Those 2 categories account for just over 3% of all farms. That is about 66,000 farms. But together they account for over half of farm production, about 54% of all farm production in our sorting. One last class I should talk about, because it's going to come back a bit later, is what we call mid-sized farms, farms with between $350,000 and $1 million in sales. They also account for a significant amount of farm production. We're going to come back to them a bit more as we go along. Now, another thing to realize, using this same categorization of farm sales, is the degree to which production is shifted to large farms over time. Here we keep the same 6 sales categories, and in fact the red is the same as the red bars you saw before. It's the distribution of production in 2016 among farms of different sales categories. What's different in this chart is the blue bar is now the distribution of production in 1996, 20 years before, across farms of different sales classes. Now, we've adjusted these for changes in inflation. So really what we're looking at here is shifts in the physical volume of production across different size classes of farms. And what's quite striking here is the shift in production from smaller to larger farms. In fact, if you look at those three leftmost classes, anyone with sales of less than $350,000, in 1996 they accounted for close to half of all farm output, 46.4% to be exact. 20 years later, 2016, their share of output had fallen to 23%. In contrast, the two largest categories, $1 million to $5 million and $5 million or more in sales, accounted in 2016 for more than half of farm production, 54%, whereas in 1996 they accounted for only 28% of all farm production. So over those 2 decades, production has shifted sharply to much larger farms. Now, how do we know this? What allows us to track this? Well, there are 2 major surveys run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that give us a great deal of information about how farming in the United States is organized. The first is ARMS, or the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, which is an annual survey of U.S. farms. It's representative of all types of farms, representative of the United States, and it's comprehensive. We get about 20,000 respondents in each year to this survey. The nice thing about the survey is it links production and practices on the farm to financial outcomes and to the attributes of the households and the operators that run the farms. It supports a variety of major data reporting services that the department provides and is a major source of research and analysis. The second survey we use is the Census of Agriculture. It's not as timely as ARMS. It occurs every 5 years. We're going into the field now for the 2017 census. It is much larger, however. It covers the entire farm population, 2.1 million farms. Now, not all of them respond to the census, although most do. And so the census itself has about 1.7 million respondents that we expand with various weighting measures to represent the whole population of U.S. farms. Given its large size and wide coverage of commodities and locations, it's invaluable for telling us information on who produces what kinds of commodities and where they produce them. All right. Now, the census has been around for much longer than ARMS. ARMS, in fact, only goes back to 1996. So the census can give us some longer run views of shifts, and it can give us somewhat different measures as well. So in this case, we use census data, and instead of those dollar figures for production and sales that I used in the earlier charts, here we're looking at cropland acreage. And we're sorting cropland acreage among, again, 6 different sizes of farms. The large green area represents the share of all cropland acreage in the United States held by the largest sales class, that is farms with 2,000 or more acres. And what you can see there is over time, going back in this case to 1987, cropland has been shifting steadily to larger farms in the United States, that is mirroring the shift of production and sales. You see among the very smallest category, the blue in the bottom, you see actually very little shift. The shift in acreage is coming from those farms in the middle, mid-sized crop farms, and with acreage shifting towards the larger farms. So you see this shift to larger farms in a variety of different types of sources and measures of size. Despite this shift, family farms still dominate U.S. agriculture. By our accounting, family farms accounted for nearly 99% of all farms in 2016 and a bit over 90% of all farm production. We can go back to 1996 with those measures as well, and we really don't see any trend change. That is, the importance of family farms has remained throughout that period. It's a distinctive feature of agriculture. Now, just to brief bit on how we define a family farm. At ERS, in our measures and reports, we define a family farm as one in which the principal operator and people who are related to the principal operator, either by blood or marriage, own more than half of the business assets of that farm business. Now, the principal operator, in turn, is the person who is primarily responsible for day-to-day management decisions on the farm. Therefore, what our definition is focusing on is the linkage between ownership of the farm business and day-to-day decision making. I should add, and this is important for later, that family status really doesn't have anything to do with legal form. Many family farms can be incorporated for tax or for management purposes. In order to contrast family farms with other types of organizations, we'll need to look a little bit more closely at corporate forms and distinguish them a little bit more because, again, many family farms are actually incorporated. Now, it's important to point out that family farms even dominate among the largest farms. Here we've sorted into a smaller set of size classes, 4 different size classes, and then an all farms class. And we show the percent of farms in blue that are family farms in each class and the percent of production in red. And what we can see is that even in the very largest class, that is farms with at least $5 million in sales, 85% of them are family farms, and over 3/4 of production in that largest class comes from family farms. So again, family operations dominate even among the largest farms. Now, the importance of family farms varies across different types of commodities. If you look all the way over on the right, we've sorted for all commodities, that is the whole agricultural sector, we've sorted production into now 4 different categories of farms. Non-family farms in the green, large-scale family farms, those with at least $1 million in sales, in the yellow, mid-sized farms with $350,000 to $1 million in sales, that's in the blue, and in the red, small family farms with sales of less than $350,000. You can then scale from the right, going back over to the left across those different commodity categories, to see where those different types of farms are most predominant. For example, non-family farms account for a little over 9% of production in all of agriculture. However, they are relatively more important in high-value crops, where they account for nearly 20% of production. Now, high-value crops are fruits and vegetables and horticulture. They're also important in beef. Non-family farms operate a number of large cattle feedlots, and that's an important share of beef production. If we look at large-scale family farms with sales of $1 million or more, where they are exceptionally important is, again, in high-value crops as well, and in dairy, as you can see, where their shares are much larger than their shares for all of agriculture. And they are less important all the way over to the left for poultry and for hay production. To round it out a bit, small family farms have relatively small shares of high-value crops of dairy and cotton. They're important in poultry production. They're also important in hay production. So again, the importance of non-family farms and of family farms of different sizes varies sharply across different types of commodities in U.S. agriculture. All right. Now, non-family farms, which are 1% of all farms and about 10% of all production, actually cover many different types. They include farms that have absentee owners. If, for example, you or I owned a farm in Iowa and we hired someone to manage it for us, that would be a non-family farm because that hired manager doesn't own it, and the owner, you or I, we don't operate it. We don't make the day-to-day decisions. Similarly, farms that are owned by a trust or by a cooperative or by an institution that have hired managers, they would be classed as non-family farms. There are, thirdly, a number of rather large family businesses whose individual farms are run by hired managers. For example, there is a potato business called Black Gold Farms that operates 11 farms across the country. The family is intimately involved in running the farm business from their offices in North Dakota. However, the individual farms are operated by hired managers who don't own the farm. We would most likely classify farms like that, and some large businesses are importantly organized that way. We would classify them as non-families because the farms themselves are not operated by members of the family. Now, there are also some small unrelated ownership groups. That is, if three people who are not related to one another join together in a partnership to operate a farming business and split that partnership equally, we'd call that a non-family farm. Those are also actually important parts of agriculture among large farms. That is, tightly organized, small, but unrelated ownership groups. Finally, there are some large, diversified public corporations that are active in farming. Those include firms like Smithfield Foods, Tyson's Foods, Cargill, or JBS Swift. Let me talk a little bit more about what those types of large public corporations do in agriculture. Each of the ones I mentioned, by the way, if you notice, are actually active in livestock production and in meat processing. Those firms typically operate some farms. They operate hatcheries, as Tyson's does. They operate sow farms that birth pigs, like Smithfield does, and they may operate cattle feedlots, as JBS Swift does. But their larger role is actually in coordination of production through contracts. So, for example, Tyson's or Smithfield's, although they birth chicks and piglets in their hatcheries and sow farms, they then contract with many other contract growers to raise those animals for them to market weight. And it's in that stage where most of the value is added through feeding and ultimately production of those animals. As a result, what Tyson's and Smithfield are heavily involved in is coordination of agriculture, even as they operate some farms. This type of activity is important in livestock production, in hogs, poultry, and cattle feeding. So large corporations have a role to play there, largely a coordination role. They're also important in key input industries for agriculture, in particular seeds, chemicals, and equipment. But again, to summarize where we've been so far, family operations still operate most farms and dominate most farm production. All right. This comes back to the question of, well, why do we see family organizations dominating in agriculture? I think there's several reasons. One, to start with, is that there are real but rather limited roles for scale economies in agriculture. In production in which scale economies are important, you need to achieve a certain size to realize minimum unit costs of production. And if you're not at that size, you can reduce costs by getting larger. In most agricultural activities, that size at which you can realize all economies of scale and minimize costs of production is still fairly small. It's fair to say that there is no General Motors or General Electric in agriculture because scale economies are not as important in agriculture as they are elsewhere. Then there are two positive reasons for family dominance. One is the flexibility of labor and decision-making in family businesses. They can react quickly to apply their labor and get out and produce the crops in response to quick changes in weather or other things going on in the environment within which they operate. Bureaucratic businesses really don't have that flexibility of labor and decision-making that you can find in family businesses. Next, localized knowledge still matters a lot in agriculture. That is, very localized knowledge of soils, of pests, of how precisely weather might impact production in your area, knowledge of local markets, and knowledge of the effectiveness of specific types of farm practices and machines on the particular land plots that the farm is operating. That has always been important in agriculture and continues to be important. In general, family businesses have the incentives and the capability to acquire localized knowledge and to be able to use it to react quickly to changed circumstances. And you really don't see that among large bureaucratically organized corporations. The exception, in a way, tells the tale here. Large corporations have an important coordination role to play, particularly in hogs and poultry. It's in those sectors, though, where production has actually become more routinized and where localized knowledge has become less important. The weather is controlled through confined feeding indoors in those sectors. Nature's controlled both through genetics and through feeding. A central organization in this case, the integrator, which is what we refer to firms like Tysons and Smithfield as, they set rules, guidelines, and protocols like a bureaucratic corporation. Those contract growers, who are family farms, provide labor and housing, and still have to react quickly to crises that hit on the farm and be careful about animal needs. But nevertheless, there is a great deal more routinization and a great deal more scope for the application of common rules across farms, and that's carried out by these integrating firms who coordinate production. What does the future hold? Well, family businesses have dominated farming for quite a long time in the United States, and they continue. There is no evidence of a shift away from them in our recent data. Furthermore, in the United States, there are many people who are capable of running their own farm businesses. That is, I think, another reason for the dominance of farm businesses in U.S. agriculture is a large supply of people who are fully capable, both for technological and financial purposes, of running their own farm businesses. The big question for the future is, will developments in information technology and genetics reduce that value that we place on localized knowledge and flexible decision making? As, for example, we bring more information technology into agriculture in the form of sensors in fields and on equipment that provide data to decision makers who could be far away. As we make more use of robots and drones, again, which could be operated from distant locations, in which those robots and drones gather as part of their operations localized information. And as genetics become optimized for specific local conditions, will these reduce the value of the localized information an individual farmer has and allow for more routinized production that's really the space for large bureaucratically organized corporations? I have to add, we haven't seen evidence of this happening so far, but it is something to take a look at closely in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. If you'd like more information on farm structure, you can go to the ERS website, www.ers.usda.gov, and go to the topic Farm Economy, Farm Structure, and Organization category. You may also be interested in a new ERS report called America's Diverse Family Farms 2017 edition. This annual report provides an overview of U.S. farms, including the latest statistics on production, financial performance, and farm household characteristics by farm size categories. Well, that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.